Let's return to Live from the State Capitol with Fred Dicker here on Talk 1300.
We'll talk about an uphill fight. Wendy Long, an attorney from Manhattan who had worked for a couple of U.S. senators and in the past worked for a conservative judicial activist group in Washington, clerked for a U.S. Supreme Court justice, promised when she became the Republican candidate, she won a primary back in June, that she could be a formidable one, give a real race to Kirsten Gillibrand. There were many people who were scratching their heads wondering how someone who had never run for office before, who wasn't known in a heavily Democratic state, could even hope to do something like that. So far, the polls show she's not doing it, and she's joining us right now to tell us maybe there is some good news for her out there. Good morning, Wendy. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, Fred. Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Well, as I said before, you're certainly always welcome here on a regular basis, as long as you're the candidate. Things aren't running very well for Republicans here in New York, certainly based on polling. And now nationally, Mitt Romney is caught up in another, or I should maybe not another, but he's caught up in this audio tape that was released yesterday in a way that looks like he's writing off something like 47% of the population, or one could make that case. But your campaign doesn't seem to have picked up any traction based on recent polls. Is there any good news out there that you can tell us about for you?
Well, I actually think, Fred, maybe I don't pay that close attention to the polls, but I think we have actually picked up in the latest polls. And these polls that come out publicly, from the colleges and so forth, aren't really the best polls. I mean, they've been shown to be inaccurate in the past.
Generally, they are accurate. Generally, they are accurate. But if you had one that showed you were really picking up, I think you'd make it public. Which you're free to do.
Public. They're already public.
Right.
Anyway,
I'm saying if you had a better one.
The time between now and Election Day, Fred, is an eternity, as you know, and things change very fast. I continue to just hammer away. I can only do what I can do. I don't believe those polls. I think I'm ahead of where those public polls say, and then our internal polls show something different, too, which I can't talk about. But I'm just telling you.
You can talk about them.
Those polls are right.
By the way, you can talk about them. And, Wendy, we always hear candidates who are far behind, year after year after year, claiming that things are really going to get better when the election comes. The election comes, invariably, they don't get better, except in the rarest of circumstances.
Well, I think this is going to be one of those rare circumstances.
Okay. What evidence do you base that on?
I think this is like when everybody showed Ronald Reagan behind, and because this is a very similar situation.
Well, hold on, though. Ronald Reagan
is in the dirt. It's in the mud. People are desperate. They're out of work. They know that the Gillibrand-Obama economy and agenda has not been helping them. They see our embassies under attack.
No, I agree with you.
They see America being attacked. And I think people are really going to wake up in the next 50-something days and realize that we cannot keep going like this. We're on the wrong track internationally. We're on the wrong track with this economy in this country. We need to get fracking in New York. It's going to be a disaster if this bypasses us.
Yeah, no question.
And I think that our current leadership sitting in Washington, in the form of my opponent, who likes to go around talking out of both sides of her mouth, who's part of this elite, entrenched status quo that wants to make people think they're dependent on government, that thinks the very best thing she can do is tax them more and spend more federal money and make them dependent on the little crumbs she's going to hand out, and talks out of both sides of her mouth about fracking, talks out of both sides of her mouth about being an advocate for women while she gets to be part of this culture of corruption in Albany. I don't think people are going to buy it, Fred, and there's a lot of time between now and Election Day, and you know what? I can't control the polls. All I can do is fight where what I know is right, and I believe the people are going to listen.
Well, I mean, one of the arguments back when you were running in the Republican primary was that at least Bob Turner, who you defeated, was a congressman, had a proven record, and people knew him. The polls still indicate, and if you have the evidence to show me something to the contrary, please do. The polls still indicate the public here in New York doesn't know who Wendy Long is. And unless you could ride Mitt Romney's coattails, which you can't in New York right now anyway, it's very unlikely that you can catch on.
Well, I'm not planning on riding anybody's coattails. I'm going to be working very hard for the next 2 months, and it's a long time. We've got one public debate, and thank you very much for offering to create another forum.
Anytime.
It's pretty clear that my opponent doesn't want to debate me.
I'm sure that's so.
She can't defend her record. I'm going to be going around publicizing that record and talking about the alternative to it and how hypocritical she is when it comes to fracking, women, jobs, the economy, you name it. She's part of this whole establishment that has ignored foreign policy and is creating the problems we have for the security of Israel and for U.S. interests in the Middle East. So there's an eternity between now and Election Day. I have come up. I'm going to come up more. It's going to come up faster. Whether it will be fast enough, I don't know, but that's not my worry. I'm going to run as hard as I can till Election Day, and I think this is going to work.
Because Ronald Reagan back in 1980 had a great ally in, President Carter, who everybody, or an overwhelming number of people had decided was incompetent. If that had been the case now with President Obama, given the economy and the Far East and other things, Middle East and other things, then you would be in a much stronger position. Why do you think it is that President Obama not only appears to be remaining popular, but he seems to be increasing his lead over Mitt Romney in the last week and a half or so?
Well,
What's going on?
He got a little bounce from the convention, and Romney has mishandled some things. But you know what? There's a long time between now and Election Day. And the fact is, this president is a disaster. And my opponent is a disaster. They've run our economy into the ground. They're killing small business, killing taxpayers. They're acting like the greatest thing they can do is hand out more money from the government that the government doesn't have. We're borrowing it to begin with. Our credit has just been downgraded again. Our national debt has been downgraded again. And our embassies are under attack under the world. Our foreign policy is collapsing. We're slapping Israel in the face yet again, who needs us to be a strong ally and get by their side in the face of what is an imminent nuclear Iran. And so I don't think things are going that well. New Yorkers are wanting to get going on fracking, and it's clear that the opponents of fracking are dragging their feet. And by the way, I don't excuse people in my party either for this. You know, there are Republicans who are deserving of criticism for this point, too. New York needs to get going on fracking. The energy policy that this Obama administration has had and that's been supported by my opponent at the behest of far-left environmentalist groups who know very well that fracking has been done safely in scores of other states, and it's not going to pose any environmental problems.
Wait a minute, just as a clarification here, Obama and company have nothing to do with giving the go-ahead to fracking in New York. In fact, the U.S. EPA, President Obama's EPA, has said it can be done safely. It's the Governor Cuomo, and his people who've been holding it up, or at least haven't made a decision.
Well, it's not only them. It's widespread foot dragging, if you ask me. And you're right. The President and the EPA are for it. My opponent talks out of both sides of her mouth. You know, she pretends to be for it when she's walking around in the southern tier with all these people who are desperate for jobs and desperate to vindicate their property values. But then when she gets in those closed-door fundraisers, you know, this is a typical problem we have with these politicians. They say one thing behind these closed doors with their fundraisers, and most of hers are the far-left liberal elite, you know, in Hollywood and California and in Manhattan, and she talks one game to them behind those closed doors, and then she comes out and campaigns around New York State and talks about, oh, yeah, how we really need to get going on fracking. And this is a problem with Barack Obama. You know, this is not unique to Mitt Romney. We saw this with Obama back in 2008 when he was talking to all these unemployed folks about these unemployed folks in Pennsylvania. Then he goes to this fancy California fundraiser and says, oh, it's not surprising. They're so desperate they need to cling to their guns and their religion. Well, you know, it's the same thing that Kirsten Gillibrand does. She tries to go raise money from people who want to kill fracking and then walks around the state pretending she's for it.
We're talking to Wendy Long, who's got an uphill fight running for the U.S. Senate on the Republican line against Kirsten Gillibrand. Wendy, I know you're an expert on the Constitution, certainly a distinguished legal scholar, and have a lot of experience over the years, and I'm sure that you share with me a very kind of gut-worrisome feeling about the demonization of this filmmaker out in Southern California who apparently is responsible for that anti-Muslim film. There is so much peer pressure, it seems to me, media pressure, pressure from the administration, being put on the idea that if he to be critical of Islam, somehow you can understand the attitude of thousands of rioting Muslims around the world, killing our people, endangering our people. But I guess it's okay if you're criticizing Catholicism, of Mormonism, of Scientology. The double standard that's emerged in the last few days seems to me it's to reflect a kind of European-type weakness towards defending free speech when the free speech involves criticism of Islam and is a threat to our First Amendment. What do you think?
I couldn't have said it better, Fred. I agree 1,000% with everything you just said. There are so many levels on which this is wrong. Point number one, this was not an official action of the U.S. government.
Of course.
It's some crack internet video. Is the U.S. government going to start going around apologizing for every little thing that's posted on YouTube? That's ridiculous. And for Susan Rice to be going around saying as she is, you know, that she's absolutely certain that this stupid internet video is responsible for the assassination of our ambassador and other Americans when it was done on 9/11. They had rocket-propelled grenades. I mean, this is just completely ridiculous.
The ignorance.
And we cannot apologize for free speech. Right. I mean, as you say, we have examples where our federal government has funded speech that is directly offensive to Christianity and other religions.
Absolutely.
Remember that thing, Piss Christ?
I talked about that before you joined us, yes.
A jar of urine. Al D'Amato spent a lot of time going after that. We don't hear anybody. Christians don't go murdering people because a crucifix was put in a jar of urine, and nobody goes around apologizing. The government not only didn't apologize for that, it actually funded that with a federal grant. So, yes, we must defend the value of free speech. There's no reason, when the government apologizes for it, it makes it seem like the government somehow is responsible for it. And, of course, it isn't. It doesn't represent the U.S. government.
Well, to me, it's a very disturbing development on a number of levels. In Islamic or Muslim societies, not all, but many of them, there's absolute intolerance for not only Christianity, or Buddhist religion, but even, as we know, been the bitter, fratricidal battles between the Shia and other Muslims, the Sunni and the Shia, killing each other. The idea that these people, and it's not all the people of these countries, of course, but the idea that they, as you touched on, that they needed the pretext of a movie to hate us, when in fact that's a core element of their worldview, to me is just a reflection of a demagogic attitude or ignorance. It had to be one or the other.
Well, I think it's the Obama administration reaching and searching, by the way, with the tacit approval of my opponent, who hasn't come out on this at all, reaching for some excuse that won't implicate their weak foreign policy. And, you know, the apology tour that Obama started in Cairo. This isn't the first time that this administration has apologized for free speech and our Constitution and American freedom and American values. This is something they've done from the very beginning, Fred. This is not new. And frankly, it's to be expected, and it has got to stop. And I think it's largely responsible for these attacks. When we show ourselves to be so weak and so apologetic, instead of strong, instead of ready to defend ourselves and our allies, this is the result.
By the way, just a quick rhetorical question. Have you seen the ACLU on this one at all?
I haven't, but I would fully expect them to be defending free speech in this case.
Well, that's what they used to do, a Nazi party or some other radical, maybe Piss Christ or whatever it might be. But somehow when it comes to, I think, criticism of Islam, they haven't been exactly in the forefront of defending people's rights to do that. Let me ask you this, Wendy. What do you make of the latest this controversy involving comments that were made at a big-ticket fundraiser by Mitt Romney, in which he appeared to write off, or one could argue it appeared he was writing off 47% of the electorate of people who were basically dependent on government and he knew weren't going to vote for him at all. He used a lot of language now that is being criticized as certainly non-political, as unpolitic, and is just alienating to a lot lot
Well, I haven't seen the actual tape, so
it's all over. It's all over TV.
Yeah, I just haven't seen it this morning. I've been out this morning and I haven't had a chance to watch it. But I mean, I've heard about it, but I haven't listened to it in detail. But I mean, like I was saying earlier, it's not surprising. Lots of politicians get into this thing where they're talking with supporters about who they're going to get votes, where they're going to get votes from. I just think, you know, Obama did it when he said people focusing on their guns and their religion. My opponent does it all the time. She says one thing behind closed doors, and she says another thing out in public. And all I can talk about is my own race. And what I say to my supporters, what I say to my friends at fundraisers is the same thing I say to you. It's the same thing I say out on the campaign trail. I am who I am. Now, with respect to the substance of what Romney was saying, I mean, I think it's just a reflection of the fact that Obama really does want to create this culture of dependency. I think it's part of his electoral strategy. I think Obama and my opponent want to be this sort of elite governing class who people are dependent upon for handouts from the government. Now, I don't believe that a lot of people who are in the 47% who are not paying taxes want to be there. I think people want freedom and opportunity, and I think that's what we should be offering them. I think our arguments are far better than the other side, and I don't think that we should give in to that. I don't think we should give up on a single person in the
That's what Romney should have been saying, right?
Jobs and people want freedom.
Yeah, that's what Romney himself should have been saying, that if the policies aren't changed, we're going to have a people who really are a permanent dependent class. I mean, he obviously shouldn't have said what he said. Don't you agree?
It sounds like it probably was
Right.
not correct. I agree. But again, I'm not sure exactly what the words were, but my point is, if anything, it reflects that the Obama-Gillibrand policy and effort is this cynical attempt to get people dependent. And people are out of work, the economy's tanking, and of course people feel desperate. And so their strategy is to say, oh, this big brother government is going to help you with all these handouts. We're going to increase federal spending. We're going to give you more. And the more you get that vicious cycle going, the more people will need and expect something from the government. We need to be going in the other direction and letting people keep their own money, letting people create jobs, letting people have freedom and self-reliance and independence.
Wendy, just quickly, you've been sending out some press releases contending that the New York Times won't write a story about what you say, I think, is either income tax evasion or erroneous IRS returns filed by Kirsten Gillibrand. It seems to involve maybe just a mistake in filing the returns. I don't think there's any evidence of tax evasion, but if you could quickly describe that situation, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Well, I did not say tax evasion. That was not at all part of our assertion. We just said, look, if you filed this tax return, it's clearly wrong. It's clearly inaccurate because the stock trade that was reported, if you look at the dates and the amounts, could not possibly have occurred. So I don't know what the real story is. All I know is what's on her tax return is inaccurate. So we tried to draw it to the attention of media and say, gee, you ought to take a look at this. Nobody seemed interested in taking a look at it, most notably the New York Times. Now, if that had been my tax return and there had been some glaring inaccuracy on it, you can be sure the media would have pounced all over it. So it's really a simple point. I don't know what the real story is. I didn't say there was any evasion. I just said there's inaccuracy on her tax return, and the media couldn't care less.
I saw one account that described it, and I think it may have come from Gillibrand's people, described it as an error in the way the return was filled out, but that it didn't indicate that there was any profit or income that taxes hadn't been paid on. Do you accept that as what this is?
I accept it if it's what it is, but if that's true, then they ought to just correct it. They ought to just correct their filing so it accurately reflects what the transaction is.
I agree.
I haven't seen them do that.
Have you put any of your taxes out, made them public income taxes?
I think that my press office is going to be doing that within the next few days.
Okay. And just finally, we only have about 2 minutes remaining. What's coming up in the next week or so that we might watch for in the Wendy Long campaign?
Well, I'm headed out to Long Island tomorrow. I have a fundraiser tonight in New York, headed out to Long Island tomorrow, and then I'm doing a big keynote speech in Yonkers on Thursday night, and then I'm on to Buffalo and Cattaraugus Friday. I'm going to be in Ontario and Monroe on Saturday.
You're working.
So I'm working all around the state.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. It's a tough challenge that you face. I understand that the issues are so enormous that I think it would be great to see a real competitive race because then we would get a debate and maybe even more than one debate. But thanks again for joining us this morning and look forward to having you back again sometime soon.
Thanks, Fred.
Okay. Take care. Wendy Long, Republican candidate for U.S. Senate.